Welcome back to another episode here at Interview At, where we teach you to use the Amazon leadership principles to land your dream job. This week's candidate was targeting a role at either Amazon or in the kind of e-commerce fintech. It was a pretty broad search. Product manager specifically, I would classify this person as a mid-career product manager, not quite at the just about to make the executive levels, but still a very solid operator, and is coming from a Fang M company, which will become clear in the interview. They ended up landing their job quite a few numbers of months back, so we're going to utilize this interview. The topic here is dive deep, and the question I used was, what is the most complex system that you have ever designed? And with that in mind, let's get into it. Although the one thing I would like to point out is, oftentimes in interviews, they can run long, up to an hour or longer. As a candidate, you should be aware of interview fatigue. It's one of those things that can set in and really kind of either cause a couple things to happen. One, your answers become less coherent. You tend to clam up and say less, or in some cases, you might tend to ramble on and on and on and on. So just be aware that this was the last question I asked her, and we'll see if it plays a factor as we get into it. This is one of my absolute favorite questions for product managers, so brace yourself. What is the most complex system, application, process, or user interaction model you have ever had to personally design?
Yeah, absolutely. So my current role is that I own the governance policy space for this Microsoft product called Power Platform. And Power Platform
Hold on a second. Time out. You own Power Platform governance?
Yeah, governance policy space.
Got it. Okay.
I do. Yeah, I do.
Me and PowerFlow, we have disagreements about how that's implemented, but we can have that discussion later.
Oh,
Absolutely a true story and remains true to this day.
really? Yeah, like anything about data loss prevention, I'm here to answer your questions.
Okay.
Yeah, I own governance policies for Power Platform, and I'll assume you don't know much about Power Platform because most interviews may not. So Power Platform is a low-code, no-code suite of products. So we have products like Power Apps.
Actually, I'm going to jump in on this one. Notice how this is actually a very helpful thing that she did, where she said, I'm going to assume that you don't know, blah, 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 blah. Whether or not she's right is immaterial. She's setting a benchmark baseline for what I, as an interviewer, may or may not know. Never assume that an interviewer understands what product you work on, what company you're at, whatever. Always set the bar. If they know about it, they'll let you know, but never make any assumptions, because you might end up using a bunch of acronyms that, quite frankly, make it hard to follow the conversation.
Apps, which allows any citizen developer, any business user to spin up an app without having any coding experience. And similarly, we have products that allow citizen developers to build AI chatbots and RPA automations, you name it. And so my role is to provide security professionals with controls with which they can prevent data exfiltration. And those controls, naturally, they get enforced on the app or the automation that the developer is building. Okay, so that's how policy works in a nutshell. And so there are a few different components that comes as part of this. I think it would be helpful for me to draw something out. So I'm going to draw it on a piece of paper, and then I'm going to take a photo and send it to you. If that's helpful.
Yeah, sure. You can send it in the chat here.
Okay, great. So, as I said, there is.
This was actually a risky move on her part. This was a first for me in doing all the interviews that I've done, where someone has tried to use the whiteboard feature or some level of whiteboarding within the context of a video interview. And there are some interview platforms that allow for this, but just if you're thinking that you're going to do that, make sure that the platform easily supports it, because what you're going to see is her holding up. It just doesn't translate as well as you think it will.
I'll start with the UI. Okay, I'll start with the UI flow, and then I'll go into like the API layer and the database that supports. So we have an admin center for security professionals to go in and create policies. Okay, the policy can say that, hey, I want, we have a connector ecosystem within Power Platform. Connector is basically a UI wrapper on top of a public service API, like for example, Facebook or any Microsoft product. And what connectors do is they give application developers the ability to use multiple data sources together within an app or an automation without having to code the API call. They can just use like a UI button and drop down to call these actions. And so one of the policies could be to block a specific connector. Like they may want to block Facebook connector, for example, or they may want to say that, hey, I want to allow my developers in my organization to use the Facebook connector, but not with my business connectors. So those are some different policies that an admin can create. Okay, so they go into Admin Center and they create a policy. And what happens is that policy gets enforced in two scenarios. One scenario is when a developer is building an app. And remember, this is a citizen developer. He's not coding. He's just using like drag and drop widgets. And then he tries to use a blocked connector. And what happens is he gets an error message that says that you're violating your organization's data loss prevention policies. Okay. So this is the developer within, like, let's say Power Apps. Now, another scenario that can happen is that a policy is edited and now an existing app or an existing automation is now not compliant with the company's policies anymore. Okay, so what that means is that the developer has already built an app, but now when a user tries to launch it, it shouldn't launch anymore because now it violates with the company's DLP policies. Does that make sense? It's a complicated space. I want to make sure.
No, it does. I understand.
Okay, great. So that's the UI. Now, what we need for this is so there are a few different so when we go into the API layer, what we need is basically a policy evaluation library. Okay, so this is UI. Okay, I'm just going to hold it like this instead of taking a photo. If you can see it, I don't know if it's inverting it on the camera.
That's fine. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. Okay, so there are a few components that interact with each other to make this happen. Now, there is a policy SDK, which is basically an evaluation library. And what it does is it takes all the connectors and different metadata of like what's used within an app. It evaluates it against a set of policies that are created by a security professional within that organization. And then it gives out three things. A is the app or automation in violation. B is what are the policies that are being violated. And C, what are the connectors, what are the connector actions, and what are the endpoints, yada, yada, that are violated. Okay. So you need a policy evaluation library, which takes in connector metadata, and also like what are the not just connector IDs, but more granular, like what are the connector actions, endpoints, so on and so forth. Okay. And it gives out, is there a DLP violation? Yes, no. And then what are the policies that are violated so that it can be surfaced in the error message, as well as what are the connector actions or connectors, etc., that are violated. Okay, makes sense so far?
Yep.
Okay. Now, like I said, the enforcement happens in two scenarios, right? So the policy evaluation library has to speak to two different components. For the scenario of an existing app going into actually I'll start with the scenario of a new app going into violation. When a connector is added in that new app, okay, and this is on the client side, the client has to get sorry, just one second. Yeah, so the client has to pass on, as I mentioned, two information. Okay, so if you can see this is the policy evaluation library, and the client has to pass on the connector metadata, connector information that the app is using. It also has to pass what are the policies within the organization to the policy evaluation library, because the policy evaluation library does not have that data in its layer. Okay. So it has to get it from somewhere. And so the client actually speaks to the policy data store, and it sends to the policy evaluation library both the policy information for that customer, as well as the connectors that are being used in that app or automation. So let's call this component that is sending everything as the studio, because the studio is where the developer is developing the system. And then when there is a violation, the policy evaluation library then speaks back to the studio, and it tells the studio that there is a violation. And I told you what the three components of that of what the policy evaluation library sends back. Now, the other part, as I mentioned, is when an existing app is violated, right? So this is during an app launch. That is when the end user who's using the app, not the developer, should get an error. And so for that, there is another component called Power Apps RP. It's basically our management plane, which like every time an app is launched, an app is saved, or any such action is made, Power Apps RP is it's like a collection of web rules that are called. And so here, Power Apps RP service makes a call to the policy evaluation library. Actually, in this case, what happens is, since Power Apps RP is not at the client side, it can keep a cache of the existing policies. So it doesn't have to, and it can also keep a cache of whether whether a given policy is violated or not for an app that is already built. So it's not something that is calculated as the user launches the app, but that information is already in the cache as to what are the policies, and if a policy is violated or not, so that that information is ready as a user chooses to launch an app. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So Power Apps RP has a cache. There is an asynchronous, I think we have like a 10-minute or a 5-minute job that runs every now and then to collect the latest policy rules and evaluate it. And every time a user launches an app, it checks for whether there's a DLP violation and throws a DLP violation error. So that's how data loss prevention works in a nutshell. Did you have any questions for me?
So which of this were you specifically? I intentionally let that one run, because sometimes I get asked questions about what is the right length of an answer. And I see some content online that says, oh, it has to be 30 seconds or 60 seconds or no more than 2 minutes. An answer should only be as long as it absolutely needs to be. This one was too long. And I let it run so that it could run, and I have the chapter marks so people can jump ahead, because it's a really long answer in which, as an individual, the candidate got lost in their own answer, had so much to share, and wanted to just kind of share. They forgot the context of the question, which is, what is the most complex thing you've ever designed? And let's create, using the STAR format, what was the situation and task? Why was it complex? Not getting into the bits and bytes and all the way down into the weeds as to how this entire architecture was meant to work together. There's clearly a lot of dive deep content here, but the problem was it stretched on so long that, again, I often talk about, a good story has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that's how you should think about the STAR format. The ST is the beginning, the A is the middle, and the R is the end. But another useful way to think about your interview answers should always be cartoon panels, right? 1, 2, 3 cartoon panels, sometimes 4, but 3. The more words you speak, the more you're filling up that cartoon panel, the more you're pushing back the interviewer who's listening to you. At some point, you got to hit pause and let the word bubble shrink so that the candidate and the interviewer can interact, that the interviewer can lean forward instead of being pushed back by all the words. So I let that one run to really drive home the point that, yikes, this was a case where a longer answer wasn't necessarily better because it kind of lost the thread. And, at some point as an interviewer, again, when you go in for an interview, The interviewer is likely tired. They're, working hard. They've got a million priorities pulling at them at all times. They've maybe looked at your resume. They've maybe looked at your LinkedIn profile. Unless they personally know you, man, something like this, it's like a killer in an interview because they just tune you out. And the cost to getting it wrong for them, meaning saying no hire on someone who's a great hire, is zero. They've tuned you out. So it's just an important thing to keep in mind as you structure your answers. There is no right length, but this was too long. And an answer should only be as long as it needs to. And this one had a lot of extra content that didn't need to be there. Designing.
The policy, so the policy evaluation library and the way it works with different, interacts with different layers, and specifically within the policy evaluation library, how would admins create, different rules? And how would admins create different policies? Because we have various features within the Power Platform Admin Center where an admin can go and create policies. So,
Okay. I'm going to go, normally I script out my questions because it makes it easier for me to take notes, but I'm going to go off script and I'm going to ask you a product-based question based on my knowledge of how your platform works, because it is an area of high frustration for me. So I'm curious now for you to answer it as a product manager accepting input from a customer. This is why I chose this question for this week. So this is why. When you work with an interview coach or you talk to an ex-sourcer or recruiter for any company that has a YouTube channel or has a coaching business that wants to help you get hired, they're not going to ask the question I'm about to ask. Okay? I've run multiple teams. I'm ex-Amazon, ex-Microsoft, XXX. I've run my own startups. I've done a lot. I've had a long and I've been very lucky with my career, very fortunate to work with a ton of smart people, but I still use tech every day. And I use the Power Platform, and I had a massive level of frustration with how it worked and some of the things it was doing. And I actually got on a call with the engineering team at Microsoft to root through a core problem they have and how they do their connectors with their specifically their Excel connector for how they're connecting to data sets that live in SharePoint. I mean, talk about being in the weeds, but my ability to ask this next question is the core difference between working with an interview coach who has no idea what you've done and probably isn't going to ask any smart questions, and doing a live mock interview with somebody who actually understands how to run a team, understands the technology, and is going to push you harder to answer the questions better based on what you've done. Because again, the core role of any interview is to A, determine if the person can do the job, and B, do we want this person working here? Your job as the interview candidate is to convince them that you can do the job. And asking questions like what I'm about to ask this person, even though you got most of the preamble, you're only going to get in a real mock interview with people who actually have run teams. So whether it be colleagues at work, maybe you don't want to tell people at work that you're interviewing, people that you know in your network, but sit down and just do a real mock interview with someone who understands technology. If you're interviewing in the technology field, if it's banking, it's consulting and questions. But ex-recruiters, ex-sourcers, they're not going to have this level of detail. That's kind of the point here, since you own the governance and policy. Okay, so the Excel connector allows for the connection to from a PowerFlow layout or whatever they call a flow to connect out to an Excel document and get data or do whatever, right? Interact with that document. And if you try to do multiple actions against that Excel file, it is using the same connector, though each connection is instantiated as a different connection. As such, given the complexity of the flow that I had designed, which had parallel paths that were code that would never, ever, ever execute within the same flow because they were parallel paths, right? They were in an if-then that it couldn't go in both paths. Unfortunately, all of those connections added up over time, right? To the point where there was something like 48 connections to a single file, which apparently the Excel connector does not like. Please don't do that. It's going to break me, right? But from a governance point of view, right? Do you view it as your responsibility to also highlight to the customer where they might be doing things that are going to create performance bottlenecks or performance problems that need to be surfaced? Because this specific bug, and I actually got a call from the engineering team because of something I posted online because they wanted to understand what I was doing, and then I spent an hour and a half with your engineering team walking them through what was going on, and they realized, oh, oops, right? But where does the responsibility for because you have a low code environment. This is kind of a rambling question. You have a low code environment, so you have non-developer customers who are trying to do things. When things break or they don't work, and they don't work with good error messages, which is what happened here, it is unclear what's happening. So where do you view your job as the purveyor of governance ending, and the designer of the connector being responsible for it doesn't work as intended?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd like to point out just one
within
point.
governance,
I'd like to point out just one point here, that this while it was a dive deep question, that was also an ownership question that I layered in there on the end, because I wanted to see how she would handle the thing outside of her scope of responsibility.
we have a few different areas. Like I said, I own the policy area, which means that we allow
Yep.
admins to create
Yep.
policies, right? Data loss prevention. So the intent is to prevent data exfiltration, either intended or unintended data exfiltration from within an organization's boundary. So this particular example that you quoted, it sounds like more of within an app or a flow, like what are the best practices of how a developer should what would the, like, if we had a center of excellence, what would be the best practice guidance in terms of how to build a hygienic app or a flow, right? So that is something that's not under my purview. But as far as policy implementation is concerned, and how that policy is enforced on the Power Automate side or on the Power App side, and the error message that should surface, that is definitely something that, I actually write the functional spec for how the error message should surface on the app and flow side.
But only for the error messages that pertain to misuse of the connector, not the connector behaving in a way that is unintended.
Correct. Misuse of the connector as defined by a security professional.
Got it. Okay. There's a bit to unpack here, but we'll get to the kind of the go-dos and the feedback that would have been read into the room on this candidate. Obviously, I've already pointed out that there was an overly long answer at the front end of this, which speaks to structure and how important having good structure is in your answer when you're in an interview. And the context there is make sure that you're very clear about what the situation or task was in front of you. In this case, it was, what's the most complex system you've ever designed? So kind of framing that out. Who was the customer? Why was this important? Why did we feel like we needed to do this? What alternatives did we consider that we rejected? What did we consider that we already had that could have prevented us from having to build new? But think about the questions that would have outlined a good situation and task for why you would build a complex system. There's, as a go-do for this candidate, and a common piece of feedback I give, there's always the risk that a candidate presents as very well spoken, but upon further review, kind of going back, and this is probably the second or third time I've seen this video since I actually filmed it, but it's the first time today in doing this video. It sounds like they're delivering good content, really meaty, great answer, but then you listen to it again, you're like, oh, woof, this is rough from an executive communication standpoint, because it's overly long, it lacked structure, it didn't have clear data as to why it was important, and what, who was being served and why, and what problems were they trying to solve. So all of these things, it made for a struggle of an answer. And then finally, I would say that her answer with regard, I kind of layered on the ownership on the last bit, was she was very pragmatic in her answer, which is, well, this is what I do, this is my box, and didn't really, like a great product manager would have said, well, but if I'm thinking about this and I could have done this, or maybe I would communicate with the team about here's how we should approach it, or maybe these are things we could consider within my team. It didn't really branch out into the possibilities. So I'm not sure why my voice cracked just there, but that's just something for you as a candidate to consider. Is when you get asked that layered on question that kind of asks for your opinion about something specific, as specific product feedback from, and I even voiced it as, and this is from the voice of the customer. Try to, especially for product managers, try to figure out how to answer in a way that says you're digesting it and want to make it actionable versus just, well, this is what I do. The feedback that was read into the room for this candidate was, candidate unquestionably has ability to dive deep. The depth of the discussion in this answer block was level appropriate and addressed major points. The candidate did not exhibit high level ability to communicate on complex topics effectively, as the answer was overly long and did not get to the point fast enough. This is a job maturity issue and should not detract from the capabilities of the candidate in this regard. And I would say, broadly across the totality of the interview, there was definitely a depth of field and an ability to dive deep. But if I were concerned about a candidate or to express concern about a candidate, I would say executive communication and ability to communicate effectively amongst teams would be something I would want to press more on. So that does it for this week's episode of Interview At, where we dive deep there, using the Amazon leadership principles, teaching you how to better structure your answers in your in your actual interviews, but we utilize mock interviews. If you are interested in signing up for a mock interview, go ahead and do so at interviewatt.com. The schedule tends to fill up. I apologize for that. I only do so many a week, but hopefully soon we'll have a better option for people who want a VIP experience. Stay tuned.